The Galactic Continuance Encyclopedia, Galactic Continuance Encyclopedia, had been in continuous publication for 340 years. In 340 years, it had grown to 47 volumes. It documented the history, culture, biology, technology, and military capacity of every species in contact with the galactic community. It was updated quarterly. It was verified by an editorial board of 231 scholars. It was considered the single most authoritative reference work in existence. Every species in the encyclopedia had a complete entry. Complete meant history, demographics, technology, culture, governance, and military strength assessment. Every volume, every species, all 6 sections, fully documented. Every species except one. The human entry was in volume 31. It had 5 complete sections. History, demographics, technology, culture, and governance were all there, thoroughly researched, carefully verified, updated with each quarterly edition as new information became available. The military strength section was 1 page. The page was blank. Not missing, not in progress, not pending verification. Blank with a single line at the top that read, "Assessment in progress. This section will be completed when sufficient verified data is available." The line had been there for 14 years. In 14 years, the editorial board had updated the human entry 47 times. The history section had been expanded. The technology section had been revised upward 3 times. The culture section had been substantially rewritten following the publication of Scholar Vel Trends, VELTRENs, foundational papers on human behavioral characteristics. The military strength section had not changed. The blank page and its single line had been there through 47 quarterly updates, through 3 revisions of the overall human entry, through the addition of 4 new subsections to the culture documentation. The editorial board's chief editor, Scholar Orath Vel, Orath VEL, had been with the encyclopedia for 22 years. He had overseen the completion of 14 species entries. He had never left a section blank for more than 2 quarterly cycles. The human military section had been blank for 56 quarterly cycles. He was asked about it at every academic conference he attended, by scholars who found the blank page both professionally puzzling and personally unsettling. Today's story is about a blank page. He always gave the same answer. We are working on it. When pressed on why it was taking 14 years, he gave a different answer. Because, he said, we want to be accurate, and accuracy in this specific case requires more information than we currently have. When pressed further on what information was missing, he gave the answer that had, over 14 years, become the most quoted thing he had ever said in any professional context. We do not know, he said. What we do not know, that is the problem. Specifically, 1 blank page in a 47-volume encyclopedia that has documented everything about every species it covers. 1 section, in 1 entry, that has been blank for 14 years, not because the editors forgot it, and not because no one tried to fill it. Because every time someone tried to fill it, they found that the page needed to be longer. And every time they made it longer, they found that the longer version was still insufficient. And every time they went back to verify what they had, they found something that required the whole assessment to be reconsidered. The blank page is not evidence of a gap in the encyclopedia's knowledge. It is evidence of what happens when you try to put a finite document around something that does not have a finite edge. This is the story of the scholars who tried, and what they found, and why, after 14 years, the page is still blank, and what the blank page actually means. The first attempt to complete the human military strength section had been made in the encyclopedia's initial research phase, 14 years ago, by a team of 3 military assessment scholars led by senior scholar Preth Krell, Prethkrel. Preth Krell was the encyclopedia's most experienced military strength assessor. She had completed military assessments for 22 species. Her methodology was rigorous and had been peer-reviewed and validated. She approached the human assessment with the same systematic framework she had applied to every previous assessment. The framework had 6 components: active military personnel count, weapons systems inventory, production capacity, strategic doctrine, historical engagement record, and what she called the capability ceiling, the theoretical maximum military output the assessed species could achieve under full mobilization. She spent 6 weeks on the initial assessment. At the end of 6 weeks, she filed a preliminary draft that was, by her own assessment, the most frustrating document she had produced in 20 years of scholarly work. The problem was not the data. The data was available. Humans maintained extensive public records of their military establishment, personnel counts, budget allocations, equipment inventories, strategic doctrine publications. The data was, in volume terms, the largest military dataset the encyclopedia had ever worked with for any species. The problem was what the data did not say. Specifically, the public data was clearly not the complete picture, and the gap between the public data and the complete picture was not quantifiable because the complete picture was not publicly available. She had encountered this phenomenon in one previous assessment, a species that maintained classified military programs. In that case, she had been able to estimate the classified component by triangulating from budget allocations, known research facilities, and the outputs of previously classified programs that had eventually been disclosed. The estimation had been approximate but defensible. The human classified component was not estimable by triangulation. Not because the classified programs were unusually well hidden, because the classified programs appeared, from what could be triangulated, to be operating at a scale that made the triangulation method unreliable. Every time she found a data point that should have bounded the estimate, she found another data point that expanded it. She filed the preliminary draft with a note. Assessment requires additional research. The public military data is extensive and internally consistent, but appears to represent a subset of the full picture. The size of the unassessed portion is unclear. Recommend extended research phase. The extended research phase was approved. It had been running for 14 years. The research team that Preth Krell assembled over the extended phase included, at its peak, 7 scholars with expertise in military assessment, technology evaluation, historical analysis, economic analysis, and what one of the team members, Scholar Vel Orath, VEL Orath, who had transferred from the classification database project, described as the specific discipline of figuring out what is behind what you can see. The team spent the first 2 years building the most comprehensive public dataset on human military capacity ever assembled. They reviewed every publicly available government budget document, every procurement record, every strategic doctrine publication, every arms control treaty submission, every historical engagement record, every academic paper on human military history. The dataset was, by the end of year 2, enormous. It was also, by the end of year 2, clearly incomplete in ways that the team could identify but could not quantify. The first incompleteness was what Orath called the reserve problem. Humans maintained, across their various national military establishments, an enormous reserve force personnel who were trained but not in active service, equipment that was maintained but not deployed. Reserve forces were standard for most species. What was not standard was the specific way human reserves were organized and what their activation represented. In most species, reserve forces represented a multiplier of perhaps 1.5 to 2 times active force capability. Human reserves, when the team attempted to calculate their activation potential, did not fit this model. The historical data on human wartime mobilization, specifically The data from the major conflicts of the 20th century showed mobilization rates and capability expansions that the standard reserve multiplier model did not account for. Scholar Prethkrell wrote in her Year 2 research notes, "Human wartime mobilization in the 20th century produced military capabilities that, at peak, were approximately 20 times the pre-war baseline in certain measurable dimensions. This is not a standard reserve multiplier. This is a structural transformation of the society into a war production system. The standard model has no category for this. I am creating a new model, but I am not certain the new model is correct because I am not certain the historical cases are representative of current capability." The second incompleteness was what scholar Drev Soul, the technology evaluator, called the velocity problem. Human weapons technology had been developing continuously for 50,000 years. In that time, it had gone through approximately 24 major generational revisions, each of which had produced capabilities that were, relative to the previous generation, substantially greater. The current generation of human weapons technology was, by available data, at the beginning of what appeared to be the 25th revision cycle. The problem was that assessing a system mid-revision produced an assessment that was accurate at the time of assessment, and increasingly inaccurate thereafter. Every other species the encyclopedia had assessed had technology that was developing at a rate that made quarterly updates adequate to maintain accuracy. Human technology was developing at a rate that made quarterly updates struggle to keep pace. Saul wrote in his research notes, "By the time we complete this assessment, verify it, submit it for editorial review, and publish it, significant aspects of it will be outdated. I do not know how to write a military technology assessment for a system that is changing faster than the publication cycle. I am noting this as a structural problem with the assessment methodology rather than a data problem." The third incompleteness, and this was the one that the team spent the most time with, was what Oreth called the visibility problem. The visibility problem was simple to state and difficult to resolve. The team knew, from multiple lines of evidence, that the human military establishment included programs and capabilities that were not in any public record. They could not see these programs. They could only see their shadows. The budget allocations that did not match publicly acknowledged programs, the research facilities that were on maps but not in databases, the occasional disclosure of a previously classified capability that had been developed and maintained without public acknowledgement for years or decades. The shadows were not small. Oreth wrote, "Based on budget analysis, I estimate that classified programs represent between 15 and 40% of total human defense expenditure. The range is large because the estimation method is imprecise. The midpoint of the range represents a larger classified military program than the total publicly acknowledged military programs of most other species we have assessed. I want to be clear about what I am saying. The portion of human military capability that we cannot see may be larger than the entire military capability of most species we have fully documented." The second formal attempt to complete the section was made at the 4-year mark. The team had, by this point, assembled the most comprehensive dataset available. They had consulted with the Vithrani Directorate's Intelligence Division, the Council's Military Analysis Office, and 3 independent research institutions that had their own Earth assessment programs. They had reviewed everything. Scholar Prethkrell wrote a draft. The draft was 43 pages. She submitted it to the editorial board for review. The editorial board's review took 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, Chief Editor Oreth Vell called Krell to a meeting. "The draft is excellent," he said. "It is the most thorough military assessment we have received for any species. I have 2 concerns." "Tell me," she said. "The first concern is the 40-page caveat section," he said. "The actual assessment is in the first 3 pages. The remaining 40 pages explain why the first 3 pages are incomplete. The caveat section is accurate, she said. The assessment is incomplete. The caveats are the honest characterization of the incompleteness. I understand that, he said. The encyclopedia's format does not accommodate a 40-page caveat section. We publish assessments, not assessments plus documentation of why the assessments are insufficient. Then the encyclopedia's format is not adequate for this entry, she said. He had expected this response. What is your second concern? She asked. The capability ceiling estimate, he said. You have provided a range. The range spans 2 orders of magnitude. Yes, she said. A capability ceiling that spans 2 orders of magnitude is not a ceiling, he said. It is an acknowledgement that you do not know what the ceiling is. That is correct, she said. I do not know what the ceiling is. The data I have is insufficient to determine the ceiling. I have provided the range that the data supports. The range is wide because the uncertainty is genuine. He looked at the draft. If I publish a capability ceiling estimate that spans 2 orders of magnitude, every other encyclopedia user who reads it will conclude that we failed to do the assessment properly. Some of them will be right, she said. The assessment is not complete. I do not have what I need to complete it. Publishing an incomplete assessment with accurate caveats is better than publishing a precise assessment that is wrong. He agreed with this. He also could not publish the 43-page draft in the encyclopedia's format. They returned the section to blank. The line at the top was updated. Assessment in progress. This section will be completed when sufficient verified data is available. That had been 10 years ago. The line had not been updated since. The research continued. In year 5, scholar Vel Orath developed what he called the shadow methodology, a systematic approach to inferring the size and character of non-public military programs from the visible data points that surrounded them. It was a new methodology, and it was, he acknowledged, significantly less reliable than direct assessment. But it was the best available approach to a problem that direct assessment could not resolve. The shadow methodology produced, after 18 months of application, a shadow estimate. The shadow estimate was not a precise number. It was a probability distribution, a range of values with associated likelihoods, produced by running the shadow methodology against all available data from multiple analytical angles. Orath presented the probability distribution to the team. The team looked at it. Scholar Drev Saul said, "That cannot be right." "I have checked it 6 times, said Orath. "The methodology is sound. The data inputs are the best available. The output is what the analysis produces. The output says that there is a 60% probability that the assessed but unverified portion of human military capability exceeds the total documented military capability of the 3 largest non-human military powers combined," said Saul. "Yes," said Orath. "That cannot be right," said Saul again. "I have heard that response before," said Orath. "I said it myself when the preliminary results came in. I said it about the tardigrade section of the fauna report. I said it about the honey badger." He paused. "Earth data produces responses of 'that cannot be right' with a frequency that I am beginning to treat as a signal rather than a refutation." The team spent 3 months attempting to find the error in the shadow methodology. They did not find an error. They found 3 additional data points that made the probability distribution wider at the upper end. In year 7, scholar Prethkrell was invited to present her research to the Council's Military Analysis Committee. She presented the shadow methodology, the probability distribution, and the 3 additional data points. The committee had 12 members. All 12 were senior military analysts with decades of experience. At the end of the presentation, the committee chair, General Vel Shari, Vel Shari, of the Dravath, Dravath, Empire said. You are saying that your best estimate of Earth's full military capability has an upper bound that you cannot determine. Correct, said Krell. And your lower bound, your minimum estimate, is already larger than most of us had understood Earth's capability to be. Correct, said Krell. And the gap between the lower bound and the upper bound represents the part that you cannot see. Correct. The general was quiet for a long time. What is in the gap? She said. We do not know, said Krell. That is the definition of the gap. Have you asked the humans? We have asked the human diplomatic mission about the public military programs, said Krell. They have been cooperative and transparent about the public programs. The public programs are well documented and match the public data. And the non-public programs? We have not asked, said Krell. Why not? Krell was quiet for a moment. Because asking would confirm that we know there is a gap, she said. And confirming that we know there is a gap without knowing what is in it seemed, to the research team, like a situation we should approach carefully. The general looked at her for a long time. That, she said finally, is the most diplomatic answer I have heard from an academic in 20 years of committee work. In year 10, the research team had a conversation with the human delegation that had been, by mutual agreement, delayed for 10 years. The conversation was requested by Chief Editor Orath Vel, who had concluded that the research team had done everything that could be done without directly engaging with the humans, and that the time had come to directly engage. The human delegation sent Ambassador Thomas Ackafer, O.H. Kafor, who had been the Outer Corridor mission's senior diplomat for several years, and who had, in that time, developed a reputation for conversations that were both honest and, by the Velhari, Velhatri, diplomatic community's assessment, occasionally surprising. The meeting was in the encyclopedia's editorial offices. Orath Vel attended, Preth Krell attended, Vel Orath attended, Ambassador Ackafer attended with one aide. Orath Vel opened the meeting directly, because he had learned over 22 years that direct openings save time. Ambassador, you are aware that the encyclopedia's human entry has an incomplete military strength section. I am aware, said Ackafer. It has been incomplete for 14 years, said Orath Vel. We have been working on the assessment for that entire period. We have been unable to complete it to the encyclopedia's accuracy standards. I know, said Ackafer. I want to ask you directly, is there information you could provide that would help us complete the assessment? Ackafer was quiet for a moment, not a diplomatic pause, the pause of someone genuinely thinking about how to answer accurately. Probably, he said, but I want to ask you something first. Ask, said Orath Vel. Your blank page, said Ackafer. Have you considered that the blank page might be the most accurate entry? The room was quiet. I don't follow, said Orath Vel. The encyclopedia documents what is known, said Ackafer. You have documented what is publicly known about human military capability. Your research team has estimated what is not publicly known. You have produced a range. The range is wide. You cannot narrow it without information you do not have. Yes, said Orath Vel. What happens if I give you the information, said Ackafer. What happens to the page? It gets filled in, said Orath Vel. With accurate numbers. Yes. Numbers that represent Earth's military capability as of the date of publication. Yes. Which will be updated quarterly. Yes. Ackafer looked at him. Scholar Krell, he said, in your research you identified the velocity problem, the rate at which human military technology is developing relative to your publication cycle. How long does it take a major capability development to go from classified program to deployed system? Krell looked at the research files. Historically, between 7 and 15 years for major systems, shorter for software and electronic systems. And your quarterly publication cycle means your assessment is updated every 3 months, said Akaffer. Yes, said Krell. So a capability that enters development today will not appear in your public data for 7 to 15 years, said Akaffer. If I tell you what we have today, you will publish that. In 7 to 15 years, what we have today will be operational history, and there will be new things that are not in your assessment. Yes, said Krell, that is the velocity problem. The blank page, said Akaffer, is the honest representation of this situation. It says, we have an assessment framework and the subject of this assessment does not fit it. A filled page would say, we know what this is. I am not certain we should say we know what this is. Orethvel looked at Akaffer for a long time. You are suggesting, he said, that the blank page should remain blank. I am suggesting, said Akaffer, that you consider whether the note at the top of the page is the accurate entry. Assessment in progress. This section will be completed when sufficient verified data is available. In 14 years, has the data become sufficient? No, said Orethvel. Then the note is still accurate, said Akaffer. A long silence. Ambassador, said Krell, are you telling me that you are comfortable with the blank page? I am telling you, said Akaffer carefully, that an accurate blank page is better than an inaccurate filled page. And I am telling you that filling the page accurately would require information that, once in a published encyclopedia, would not be in a published encyclopedia anymore. Krell looked at him. It would be classified. It already is, said Akaffer. I am explaining why it will stay that way. Chief Editor Orethvel spent 2 weeks after the meeting with Ambassador Akaffer, reviewing the research team's work and the conversation's implications. He was a scholar. He had spent 22 years in the business of documenting what was known. He believed in the value of accurate documentation and had built his career on producing it. The blank page violated everything he believed about encyclopedia editing. The blank page was also, he concluded after 2 weeks of careful thought, the correct entry. He wrote a memo to the editorial board that explained his reasoning. Encyclopedia's purpose is to document what is known, he wrote. The human military strength section documents what is known about human military strength, that the public data is a subset of the full picture, that the full picture is not publicly available, that the gap between the public data and the full picture is not quantifiable with available tools, and that the assessment framework we use for all other species does not adequately capture the specific characteristics of this subject. The blank page with the note at the top accurately documents all of this. A filled page with a capability assessment would accurately document the public data and inaccurately imply that the public data is the complete picture. I am recommending that we update the note at the top of the blank page to more fully explain why it is blank. I am recommending that we add a summary of the research team's 14-year work as a supplementary appendix. And I am recommending that we acknowledge, in the encyclopedia's editorial notes, that the human military strength section represents an assessment methodology limitation rather than a research failure. The blank page, he concluded, is the most accurate thing we have published about human military strength. It accurately documents the shape and size of what we do not know. In 22 years of encyclopedia work, I have never been more certain that the honest entry was the empty one. The editorial board voted on the recommendation. The vote was unanimous. The note at the top of the page was updated. It now read, Military Strength Assessment, Methodology Insufficient. The public data on human military capacity has been comprehensively documented in Appendix C of this volume. The public data is verified and accurate. The public data does not represent the complete picture. The gap between the public data and the complete picture has been studied for 14 years by a dedicated research team. The gap cannot be quantified with available tools and methodology. The lower bound of the gap, the minimum assessed but unverified capability, exceeds the total documented military capability of most species in this encyclopedia. The upper bound is not determinable. This section will remain blank until assessment methodology adequate to this subject is developed. See Appendix C for the complete research summary. Appendix C ran to 240 pages. It was the longest appendix in the encyclopedia's history. It ended with a section that Preth Krell had written, and that Oreth Vel had included over the editorial board's mild objection that it was somewhat personal for an encyclopedia entry. The section read, "The research team's 14-year effort has produced the most extensive assessment of a single military subject in this encyclopedia's history. The conclusion of that effort is that the subject exceeds the assessment framework. This is not a failure of the research. It is a finding. The finding is that some subjects cannot be adequately represented in the formats designed for standard subjects. The blank page is the honest representation of this finding. We have documented, with as much accuracy as available methodology permits, the shape of what we do not know. The shape of what we do not know about Earth's military strength is, itself, significant information." The updated entry was published in the encyclopedia's next quarterly edition. The blank page, with its expanded note and its reference to the 240-page appendix, became, within the academic community, the most discussed entry in the encyclopedia's 340-year history. Not because the blank page was alarming, because it was honest. And honesty in reference work was considered the standard, and encountering a subject that honesty required leaving blank was, in the academic community, genuinely significant. Scholar Preth Krell was invited to present the research team's methodology at 6 academic conferences in the year following publication. At each conference, she presented the same thing: the 14 years of work, the shadow methodology, the probability distribution, the conversation with Ambassador Akaffer, and the editorial decision. At each conference, the most frequently asked question was, "What is in the gap?" Her answer was always the same: "We do not know. That is the definition of the gap." At the 4th conference, a junior scholar named Vel Sol asked a different question. "You said the lower bound of the unverified capability, your minimum estimate of what you cannot see, exceeds the total military capability of most species in the encyclopedia," said Vel Sol. "That is the lower bound. What is the upper bound?" Krell looked at the scholar. "We do not have an upper bound," she said. "The analysis does not converge on an upper bound." "What does that mean in practice?" asked Vel Sol. "It means," said Krell, "that every time we have added data to the analysis, the upper bound has extended rather than contracted. After 14 years of adding data, the upper bound is further from our lower bound than it was at the beginning." Vel Sol was quiet for a moment. "So the more you learn about what you cannot see, the larger what you cannot see becomes." "That is the most precise summary of the methodology's results I have heard," said Krell. "That is not reassuring," said Vel Sol. "No," said Krell, "it is not. It is, however, accurate, and I have concluded after 14 years that accurate is more valuable than reassuring." Ambassador Akaffer, who had been invited to observe the conference and was sitting in the back of the room, did not say anything. He was, Krell noted, maintaining the specific quality of attention of someone who was finding the presentation interesting, but who had already known everything in it. At the end of the session, he approached her. "The junior scholar's question," he said, "the upper bound extending as more data is added. I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "We do not know what the upper bound is either," he said. She looked at him. "We have our own assessments," he said, "our own analysts, our own methodology. The gap between what is documented and what exists, we know the gap exists. We monitor its boundaries. The boundaries are not stable. Not stable in which direction? She asked. He looked at her with the expression of a diplomat who has said what he is going to say and is choosing not to say more. The page is blank for good reasons, he said, on both sides. In the encyclopedia's 47th volume, updated quarterly for the past 14 years, the human military strength section remained one page. The page was blank. Below the expanded note, in the space where the assessment would eventually appear, the editorial board had made one addition in the most recent quarterly update. It was not an assessment. It was a single line from the appendix research, selected by Oreth Vel because he believed it was the most accurate summary of everything the research had produced. It read, "The blank page is not evidence of a gap in our knowledge. It is evidence of the size of what we are trying to document." The line had been there for 2 years. It would, everyone agreed, be there for some time longer. Below it, in the administrative notes that most readers never saw, Scholar Vel Oreth had added the final entry of the research team's 14-year file. It read, "Assessment ongoing, upper bound not converging, lower bound remains significant, the page is blank, the blank page is accurate, the blank page is the work." And that is the story of one blank page, 14 years of research, 240 pages of appendix, and an ambassador who said, "The blank page might be the most accurate entry." Here is what I want to leave with you today. The encyclopedia's scholars did their job. They applied the best methodology available. They spent 14 years on the problem. They produced the most comprehensive assessment of a single military subject in the encyclopedia's history. The conclusion of all that work was, the page should stay blank, because a blank page that accurately describes the shape of what is unknown is more valuable than a filled page that misrepresents the subject as something that fits a standard framework. There is something profound in that. We live in a world that rewards filled pages, that treats blank spaces as evidence of failure, of insufficient effort, of a gap that needs to be covered. We are trained to produce answers, to close uncertainties, to document what we know in a way that looks complete. The encyclopedia scholars decided after 14 years that the blank page was the right entry, not because they gave up, because they were honest, because accurate and complete are not always the same thing, and when they are in conflict, accurate wins. The other thing worth sitting with is what the blank page represents. The lower bound of what the encyclopedia cannot see about Earth's military strength exceeds the total documented military capability of most other species. The upper bound is not converging. Every piece of data they add extends the range rather than narrowing it. The ambassador said the page is blank on both sides. We did not set out to be undocumentable. We set out to survive, and to build, and to solve problems, and to develop capabilities in every generation that the previous generation would not have recognized. We have been doing this for 50,000 years. The result is something that does not fit in a standard encyclopedia entry. The blank page is the honest representation of that result. Some things are too large for the framework. The correct response to that is not to force them into the framework. It is to acknowledge the shape of what the framework cannot hold. The blank page is that acknowledgement. If this story landed for you today, if you recognize the shape of the gap, or the ambassador's line about both sides, or the research team's conclusion that accurate is more valuable than reassuring, then this channel was built for you. Subscribe if you haven't. Every week we bring stories about what we are and what that means when the galaxy tries to document us. Leave a comment. Tell me, what is the blank page in your life? The thing that does not fit the standard framework, that gets bigger the more you try to understand it, that the honest answer about is, we do not know what the upper bound is. I read every comment. I want to know. Share this with someone who needs it today. The man who has been told his blank page is a failure, who has been asked to fill in the framework with something that does not fit the framework. Tell him, the blank page is not evidence of a gap in your documentation. It is evidence of the size of what you are trying to document. Keep working. The upper bound is not converging. That is not a problem. That is the work. This is Fitzage. We will see you next time.